Just so everyone knows, the meeting will be live streamed to Facebook Live on our event page and will later be posted up onto YouTube. Where is that scene behind you, Trent?
I can't tell you that. That's my secret caribou hunting spot.
Okay, never mind.
It's the White Mountains.
Nice.
It's not that secret, really.
But he has a secret glassing rock or something.
It's a pretty nice place. It was a fun trip.
Yeah.
One of the few moments when it wasn't raining.
All right, we'll probably wait maybe 2 more minutes, give it till 5:33 or so. Well, I think the attendees most folks are here. So welcome everyone to the Susitna River Coalition's final winter speaker series event of the season. We're super excited to have you here and really pleased at how this virtual platform has worked this year. My name is Margaret Stern and I'm the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Susitna River Coalition. You will also see Melissa Hoyer pop in and out. She's the Executive Director of the Susitna River Coalition. And of course, we have Trent Sutton, who's here to chat with us about Pacific Lamprey. Before we get started, I would like to thank our generous sponsors and donors with the Chase Community Council and the Talkeetna Community Council, as well as all of our generous individual donors that make events like this possible. Just so everyone knows, we will be streaming on Facebook Live, and we are also going to upload this onto YouTube later. So if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with folks, please feel free. Also, we will be taking questions at the end, so feel free to type them into the chat as you have them, and we will get them answered for you. So I'd like to welcome Trent here today. Trent has been a faculty member at the University of Alaska Fairbanks since 2007, and previously held faculty positions at Purdue and Lake Superior State University. He has a Bachelor's of Science in Fisheries and Wildlife from the Michigan State University, a Master's of Science degree in Biological Sciences from Michigan Technical Institute, and a PhD in Fisheries Science from Virginia Tech. So he has accomplished quite a bit over his academic career. He has taught 31 different undergraduate and graduate courses in fishery biology and management. He has completed 37 graduate students, currently has 4 graduate students in his research program, and has published 117 peer-reviewed papers, journal articles with 4 proceedings, 5 book chapters, and is one of 3 co-editors of Fisheries Techniques, the 3rd edition. He's an active member in the American Fisheries Society, has served as the past president of the Indiana and Alaska chapters and the education section of the American Fisheries Society. He has served as the Associate Dean of Academic Programs for the University of Alaska Fairbanks College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences since July 2014, and as the Director of the Undergraduate Research and Scholarly Activity for the UAF Trophietta Campus, Rural Campuses, and CTC. So welcome here, Trent. We're really excited to hear about lamprey and the Susitna, and I will pass the mic and the camera over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Margaret, and thanks for the invitation to be here tonight. I love talking about lamprey. I've got a long history. My master's degree research was on larval sea lamprey and northern brook lamprey back in Michigan. So when I was at Michigan Tech as a graduate student, so I basically cut my teeth on research on lamprey, no pun intended there. And so it's been a lifelong passion. And so at various positions over my career, I've gotten to work with lampreys sort of in fits and starts. And And when I came to Alaska 15 years ago, there was an open opportunity to do more lamprey research. And so I sort of took the reins and ran with it. And so we've been kind of ramping up our efforts. So it's a great opportunity to share with some of the work we've been doing, especially more recently as it relates to Pacific Lamprey, although I'll talk a little bit about a couple of other species that we see in the Susitna River drainage, Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey. And then specifically the work we're sort of ramping up to start in the Susitna, a little bit of pilot work we've already done, but a much more concerted effort the next couple of years. And so give me a moment to get everything. It's where all worked earlier, so make sure it works again. Hopefully everything popped up there just okay. All right, so the title slide. So the title of my talk today is a Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative in Alaska, a new focus on an old fish. And I say that because there's been a lot of work on Pacific Lamprey for a number of years now, but in Alaska, that's not the case. It's pretty new, like new in the last couple of years. And lamprey are really old fish. One of the little fun facts I like to talk about with lamprey, not only did they predate the dinosaurs, but they've been around since before the rings of Saturn were formed, to give you some idea. So they've been around for a really, really long time and largely unchanged that whole time. They're an incredibly resilient group of fish, very, very primitive. And so I'm going to present this today, and I just want to acknowledge my co-authors that have played a role in this project. Sabrina Garcia, who's at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and one of my partners in crime. We're co-chairs of the Alaska Regional Management Unit for the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. Alicia Mars, who's from the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. Nate Cathcart, who's with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. He actually works with the Anadromous Waters Catalog and has access to a lot of data and information on lamprey throughout the entire state of Alaska. But also Nate will be coming on as one of my new PhD students to work on Pacific Lamprey in the Susitna River drainage. And then Bruce Wright from Connect Tribe. And I've only met Bruce relatively recently. I gave a talk at the Matsu Science Salmon and Science Symposium back in the late fall. And Bruce contacted me after that presentation and sort of developed a relationship. And he's got a lot of interest in lamprey in the Susitna River. So I think it's going to be a really interesting collaboration moving forward. So those are my co-presenters, co-authors. What I wanted to do today are talk about a couple of things. Sort of really the talk's broken into three parts. I'm assuming that most of you probably are not lamprey biologists. And so a little primer on lamprey biology is certainly warranted. I'll talk a bit about their life cycle, their life history, and then a little bit about lampreys in Alaska. We have 5 species, by the way, and you might not have known that. And we have 3 species in the Susitna River drainage. And then I'll talk a bit about PLCI, the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative, how it came about, what are the various components, and then its relevance to this work, because it really is the reason we're doing the Susitna River work. It'll make a little more sense here in a little bit. And then I'll talk about what we've done and what we're planning to do in the Susitna River. And then I'm going to end on an opportunity for all of you, if you want, to get involved in this work. You can be involved in a couple of different ways. Some maybe it's a little bit, some more active than others, but I'll give you that opportunity and some contact information if you're so interested. So I'll sort of jump in with a little bit about lamprey biology. So lampreys are interesting. They belong to the superclass Agnatha. So there are 2 superclasses, Agnatha and Gnathostomata. Gnathostomes are the jawed fishes, which are the things that most people think about, like they have active moving jaws, whereas the Agnathans don't. They don't have an active moving jaw. So lampreys and hagfish, if you're familiar with them, they produce a lot of slime, are the only 2 members of this superclass. So they're jawless fishes, like I said, very primitive, very ancestral. We think there's 40 species of lamprey globally. There's some big debate about that. That's one of the more recently published studies by Claude Renaud in 2011. But depending on where you look, it can range anywhere from 38 to 43 species. And then there's a whole nother issue I'm not even going to bring up today. Like, what do you define when you talk about lampreys as species? But we're not going to go there because that gets a little more complex. Most lamprey are found in the Northern Hemisphere. In most of the species, there's a couple of exceptions. This guy right here, this is a pouched lamprey, which is a really unique species found in the Southern Hemisphere. You can find them in Australia, in New Zealand, in Argentina, and a couple of other places as well. But most of them are northerly distributed in the Northern Hemisphere. The you might have seen a picture, like if you ever looked up lamprey life history, you might have seen something like this. And this is a very simplified version, but I kind of want to go through it because it kind of sets up a couple of other things, but I'm going to deviate from it because this isn't actually 100% correct either, based on some new information we have about lamprey. And so lamprey are very much like salmon, Pacific salmon, in that they are, most lamprey are very much like salmon in that they spend some period of time out in a lake or a reservoir or out in the ocean feeding on other fish. And I'll come back to that in a second. They all are going to undergo some type of a spawning migration into freshwater. So they all spawn in freshwater. They're all spring to early summer spawners. And of course, when spring and early summer is, depends on where you're located. For us, that's June primarily, early July for the most part. But they're making upstream spawning migrations in the freshwater rivers. They spawn in clear water tributaries. So they might use systems like the main stem Susitna or the Yukon or the Tanana as migration corridors, but they're spawning in clear water systems. They're semiparous, so they spawn and die. They create a redd, just like a salmon. They do it a little bit differently. Instead of using they do use their caudal fin to kind of scour it a little bit, but mainly what they do is they actually, with that suctorial disc, they grab rocks and they move them around physically. So you see lamprey sort of pulling rocks around and sort of putting them in piles, and then the female deposits the eggs and the male deposits the milk, and then the miracle happens, and then they spawn, then they die. The eggs incubate pretty quickly, 10 to 14 days roughly, and then the larvae hatch out. They're very small, a couple of millimeters long, and then they drift downstream, and that's when you get to this larval phase, which is really interesting. You can go in any of these clear water tributaries in Alaska and find larval lamprey. They're burrowed in the sediment, so they're spending some time there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. We don't know how long they spend in that larval phase here in Alaska. In other systems where you can reliably age lamprey, larval lamprey, we can't do that here in Alaska because the alkalinity we have is so low, they can't form statilis, and so therefore we can't use that to age like you would use like otoliths in a fish. But based on other systems, we know that they spend between 3 and 10 years in that life stage. They grow really slow. You don't even know they're there. They're burrowed in the sediment. They're, unless you're actually looking for them or trying to dig them out, you would never even, maybe you see one occasionally moving downstream, but by and large, you wouldn't let them know. At some point in time, when they reach roughly, in the case of Arctic lamprey or Pacific lamprey, they reach 140 to maybe 170 millimeters. So they're at this age, at that point they're 5-6 inches long. They undergo this sort of transformation, and they sort of metamorphose. Is when, I should also mention, the larvae don't have functional eyes, so they're basically blind. They can detect light, but they can't see. So then the eyes form. Their mouth apparatus is completely different. The larval stage, they develop that suctorial mouth, and then they outmigrate downstream to some body of water where they're going to either parasitize other fish. So if you think about like sea lamprey in the Great Lakes where they're invasive, you've seen pictures of them latched onto the side of a fish where they suck their blood, basically. Pacific lamprey do that. But that idea that all lamprey at this stage are parasitic is wrong. There are a number of lamprey species that are truly predatory. We have 2 of them in Alaska. Arctic lamprey and Western river lamprey are predatory lamprey species. So when they leave, in the case of Arctic lamprey, they leave the Yukon or the Susitna or the Kuskokwim River and they begin to feed. They're feeding on things like capelin and Pacific sand lance and Pacific herring and salmon smolts. They're actually physically eating them. We're taking chunks out of them, and we actually I had a student of mine look at that a few years ago using some eDNA and some other gut content analyses. And they spend a year or 2, maybe 3 out in sea. In the case of Alaska, like I said, the two of the anatomy species we have around here, or at least in interior or south central Alaska, Arctic lamprey spend most of their time on the shelf, the Bering Shelf, and then Pacific lamprey go off the shelf into deeper water, and they feed on things like Pacific cod and halibut and pollock and a few of those other bigger species. And then they start it all over again. They undergo the migration. And I was telling Margaret this a little bit earlier. One of the really interesting things about lamprey is that they don't have site fidelity like Pacific salmon do. They don't return to their home stream to spawn. they randomly go to somewhere else. And one of the things that's been discovered about them is these larval lamprey, when they're in the stream, produce bile salts, and those bile salts drift downstream. And these adults, if they happen to end up, you could have a Pacific lamprey that originated in Oregon from the Willamette River, ends up in the Gulf of Alaska because that's where it got carried to, because it's latched onto the side of a Pacific cod, and it happens to pick up the bile salts from larval Pacific lamprey that are in the Susitna River drainage, and it picks that up, and that's where it ends up and goes to spawn. That's kind of how random and distributed it is in the case of lamprey. So a very different type of situation with lampreys than what you see with salmon, but there's some similarities there between the two, and they utilize some similar habitats as well. So that's a very brief overview of the lamprey life cycle. It's a little more complicated than that, but that, I think, hopefully you get the gist for the most part. And to kind of talk about a few more things, like, again, talking about these larval lampreys, and they're also called anesthetes. This is kind of what I'm talking about. This is like their mouth structure. They got this oral hood, and there's this sort of filter feeding apparatus, and they're burrowed down in the sediment, and they're feeding on organic detritus. So that's what this material is here. This is what I looked at as a master's degree student. I looked at larval lamprey gut contents and spent all my time looking through a microscope, counting diatoms, staining bacteria, counting the number of bacteria, and then trying to quantify the amount of organic detritus they were assimilating, they're actually quite phenomenal life history when you look at it that scope. But that's because this is such a poor energy source for them. It takes them a long time to grow, and that sort of ties in very nicely with their life history that way. But you'd be amazed at the density of larval lamprey in most streams. There's a lot more out there than what you can ever imagine, and we have a couple of ways we can sample for them. I'll talk about a little bit later as well. It's the juvenile stage that again outmigrates, again, that develops the functional eyes, which you can see right there, and has that sort of that oral disc that most people kind of don't like for the most part. It looks kind of spooky and creepy, and has those chitinous teeth and that sort of rasping tongue that they can scrape off the side of the scales and then through the flesh, and they produce actually an anticoagulant. So that keeps the blood flowing, much like a vampire would do. And that's, again, the idea that they're parasitic. This is where that idea comes from, mostly from the sea lamprey literature, because in the Great Lakes, where they've been very problematic, that's what you would see. And in the case of the Great Lakes, they actually kill their hosts. They're not co-evolved with their host fish, whether that's lake trout or Chinook salmon or lake whitefish or whatever it might be. That's why they kill them there, because their hosts are quite small relative to what they would normally encounter when they're in their normal distribution, which is along the Atlantic coast and the Atlantic Ocean. And that's why in the case of the Pacific lamprey, which do the same type of thing, they don't usually kill their hosts. They feed on big prey like Pacific cod or halibut or pollock, and they spend some time rasping, drinking their blood, and then they drop off, and then they'll move to a new host. And like I said, not all lamprey do that. You have species like Arctic and Western river lamprey that are predatory. So there's some different life history strategies that they utilize depending on the species. And I didn't even talk about the fact that, again, about half the lamprey species are either parasitic or predatory, and then the other half are non-parasitic. They don't even feed at all as at that juvenile stage. They go from larvae to adult. They basically bypass the juvenile stage and then spawn and die. So in the case of Alaskan brook lamprey and in Western brook lamprey, which we also have in Alaska, they follow that strategy. So like I said, the life history of a lamprey looks quite simple in its basic form that I presented, but there's a lot of interesting nuances depending on the species. And there's a whole nother concept about paired species that, maybe, for example, Arctic lamprey and Alaskan brook lamprey, which you find in the same system, aren't even two different species. They might be the same species, but different life history variants of one another, like a steelhead and rainbow trout, or there's other examples out there. But so there's a lot of interesting questions about them, but they have a really interesting life history that, again, a lot of really, I think, that makes them a phenomenal group of fish to look at when you start thinking about the different nuances of different species. And just to point something out here, like this is a good example. These are And these are sea lamprey, and so they have a really strong dentition, a very large buccal funnel. This is one of these little brook lampreys I'm talking about that are non-parasitic, and so you can see their mouth isn't very big. They don't have very strong dentition there, so you can begin to sort of detect some differences. They're actually quite small, like a sea lamprey can get a couple of feet long. In our case, like an Arctic lamprey would be maybe 12 to 20 inches. A Pacific lamprey can be 24 to 36 inches. One of these little Alaskan brook lampreys, which you can find in the Susitna River, pretty common in June to see them spawning. They're like 5 to 6 inches, so they're quite a bit smaller than the bigger anadromous species. Which brings me to what we have here in Alaska. Like I mentioned, we have 5 species. Western brook lamprey and Western river lamprey are only found in South Central Alaska, or southeastern Alaska, sorry. That's the northern extent of their geographic distribution. They're found a lot further south in British Columbia and in Washington and Oregon. Western brook lamprey are non-parasitic. Western river lamprey are predatory. We have Pacific lamprey, which are parasitic. They don't have a paired species. And then we have Alaskan brook lamprey, which are also non-parasitic, and then Arctic lamprey, which are predatory. And these 3 species are found in the Susitna River drainage. And we're sort of at the northern edge of the Pacific lamprey distribution and the southern edge of Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey distribution. So you can find all 3 species in the same system, same tributaries in that system. And I'm going to talk a bit about all 3 of these species with a little more basic information before I start talking a little more specifically about Pacific lamprey. So a little bit about Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey. This is according to ADF&G, their distribution. So we know they spawn in the Yukon River drainage, the Kuskokwim River drainage, and in South Central. So in the Susitna River drainage, we know that in the case of Arctic lamprey, they're in the juvenile stage. They feed over here in the Bering Sea and in the northern Gulf of Alaska. But we don't have real good information on their population status. We don't have any systems like abundance or density estimates, with a few exceptions, which is really surprising given the fact that in the lower Yukon River, there is a commercial and subsistence fishery for Arctic lamprey. And I'll show some picture of that here in a couple of seconds. So there has been some work done in the Yukon, a little bit in the Kuskokwim, a very little bit in the Susitna River drainage in terms of looking at distribution and status. And we're going to be ramping up some of that in the Susitna River here soon. There have been active collections in the Yukon drainage. We've done a lot of that work up in interior Alaska, like in the Chena and the Chattanooga rivers, and been a few other systems that's been worked on, like the Gasaza and the Andreevsky as well. We just started some work a few years ago in the Susitna. We're going to be continuing that this next summer. A fair bit of work in the Bering Sea. They get picked up in trawl surveys all the time. And so we've been able to, we sort of have a sort of running tab on getting those. And I have a freezer full of these marine phase feeding Arctic lamprey in my lab that we've done some work with, looking at food habits and diets, and we have a lot more opportunity. So we'll continue that work. But like I mentioned, there's this rarely substantial Arctic lamprey, historically subsistence fishery, but since 2003, a combination of commercial and subsistence fishery. And it's a traditional fishery, again, targeting these adults as they're moving upstream. So the time of year usually is late November and early December. And again, these are a traditional food source. They're consumed by indigenous communities, primarily in the lower Yukon River, but up into the middle of Yukon as well. And they're fished through the ice. So they cut these holes in the ice. The traditional gear is what's called an eel stick. It's basically, it looks like a hockey stick almost, with a couple of like nails or pegs sticking out of it. And the idea is that the lamprey are moving right beneath the ice surface. And they latch onto the ice as moving upstream. They're not, lamprey are poor swimmers. They swim maybe 12 to 15 miles per day. So they're slowly making their way upstream. They enter the lower Yukon River as early as September. And again, they're trying to make their way up to their spawning grounds by the following June. So it's a long haul for them. But as they're making their way upriver and they cut these holes out, they're scooping them out. Again, historically with these eel sticks, that's not quite as efficient as using dip nets, which you see here, but they're scooping up lots of lamprey. and then they're selling them quick pack fisheries, which is in the lower Yukon, buys them up and they sell them to a vendor. And I was just in a meeting on Friday and talking about where do these lamprey go? Like, what is the market for them? And one of the theories is they get sold to this vendor over in the UK, and they're marketed for this lamprey pie industry that they sell in pubs. Which historical food in the UK. I've heard that they're sold as for the pharmaceutical industry because they're so lipid rich, they're so oily that there's a lot of value in them, like for things like makeup and things like that. I have a jar of lamprey oil lamprey oil pills in my office that are from Japan. So there's various markets for them. And in addition to the fact that they're consumed by indigenous communities as well as human food, but also dog food as well, because they're so lipid rich. But there's a big fishery, which is why most of the focus historically on lamprey in Alaska has been on Arctic lamprey, because of this fishery. But it's not the only fishery. There's actually a small scale fishery in the Pacific Lamprey River. And I'll talk about Pacific Lamprey here in a little bit. And just to give you some idea, again, this is the only quantitative data that really seems to exist out there. So the commercial fisheries in orange, and the subsistence harvest is in this sort of maroon color. 2003 is the first year of the commercial fishery. And so you can see there's a lot of variability in harvest from year to year. Some years are big years and some years are not. There's no good quantitative data on subsistence harvest prior to 2003. There's some good LTK information, local traditional knowledge, and we need to get that information to get a better understanding on it. And that's a project that's waiting to happen. But subsistence harvest most years is pretty low for the most part, and commercial harvest is highly variable from year to year. The last couple of years has been almost not. I don't have the 2021 data in here yet. The report's not out, but I talked to the biologist and I was told that it was pretty low. So the last 5 years has been almost no harvest, and the question is why? Is it climate change? Is there something changing with run timing? Is it the fact that ice in the lower Yukon isn't forming quite as early as it has, and so you can't get out there and fish? We don't know. A lot of questions, more questions than we have answers, unfortunately. But anyway, it's a really sort of interesting fishery nonetheless. Pacific Lamprey a little bit different in the sense that when it comes to information, as little information as we have on Arctic Lamprey and even lesser on Alaskan brook lamprey, we have even less information on Pacific Lamprey. So we know this is the distribution based on what ADF&G is telling us. We know that they spawn in south central Alaska. So we know they're in the Kenai River. We know they're in the Susitna. We know they're in the Copper, and then throughout southeastern Alaska as well. But there's no good records of that. There's no quantitative information. We know that they feed primarily in Bering Sea off the shelf and in the Gulf of Alaska. And we do get a little bit of that information in some of those samples as well. But the problem, they're deep water, and so there's not a lot of those deep water trawls that are happening every year. So we maybe get a handful a year in our collections, which is better than none, but we have a long ways to go. And there's a lot of interest in sort of looking at feeding and sort of some of the work we've done on Arctic Lamprey, doing the same thing with Pacifics to see what they're actually feeding on as well. Population tests, we know nothing about Pacific Lamprey in any system in Alaska as far as abundance. So big black box, big question mark there. As far as collections, we did a little bit of work in 2019 in the Susitna River. There's some other collections that have been done as well, but again, sort of, fits and starts, nothing really dedicated and focused. We did get some samples a couple of years ago in the Copper River. That was good and a good start. And we've got some samples from the Bering Sea as well. But if I look at kind of where we are with Pacific Lamprey relative to Arctic Lamprey, it's not even in the same ballpark. We have a long ways to go here, which is really exciting in some ways. For someone like me, it's like basically an open slate to kind of sort of anything we do is knowledge. Anything we can collect, any samples we can get is sort of making some strong headway. But we also have a long way to go. And when I look at what my counterparts are doing down in Washington and Oregon and Idaho and California, where they've been doing this work for a long time, we are like light years behind. But I think we can close the gap here soon. And that's where, nice segue here, that's where PLCI comes in. So PLCI is the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative. It was formed in 2016. It is one of the National Fish Habitat Partnership Programs. So it's a federal initiative. It is the 20th of these fish habitat partnerships that was created. In Alaska, we have 6 of them in total. So these are all the fish habitat partnerships here in this map. Alaska has 6 of them, which is great. There's the Matsu Salmon Partnership, which you all probably all well know an awful lot about. And then there's the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative, which is its own fish habitat partnership, which is great and really sort of fosters a lot of this work. Basically, what the Fish Habitat Partnership Program is, they mentioned it's a federal initiative which was created to address local and regional fish habitat assessment and restoration needs on a nationwide basis. And it does this in one of 2 ways, actually both ways. It first off, it supports science-based fish habitat assessments. I mean, we all know that if you don't have habitat, you're not going to have fish. It's that simple. And so understanding those habitat relationships, what's there, what's not there, what's missing, what life history stages can be represented or not, is a key aspect. And then once we've done that, then actually getting out there and funding local restoration projects. Again, primarily habitat focused, but the idea is if you build it, they will come kind of a thing. If you provide the habitat, you should get the fish. And so, that's one of the sort of underpinnings of the Fish Habitat Partnership Program and underpinning of the Pacific Lamprey Conservation Initiative as well. The actual sort of precursor to PLCI, the foundation of it, really sort of goes back to the cultural significance of Pacific lamprey in the Pacific Northwest. In that region of the world, Pacific lamprey are an incredibly important subsistence food and medicinal resource. Indigenous communities all up and down the Columbia River drainage, for example, have long regarded Pacific lamprey as a very important, it's a very spiritual animal to them, and they played a big role in their communities. And so it was the concern by these indigenous groups for maintaining the long-term sustainability of Pacific lamprey that really led to the creation of PLCI. And as a consequence of various restoration initiatives that are part of that, of the PLCI program. Harvest of Pacific lamprey, even though populations are depressed throughout their entire distribution, still happens today. Probably the best example is in the Columbia River drainage, the Willamette River, Willamette Falls, which is big falls. Pacific lamprey, and these are all lamprey attached to this rock right here, actually can climb their way up the falls. I mean, because they have that sectorial disc, they can actually inch their way up. It's a really amazing thing to watch. But indigenous communities still are allowed to go and conduct traditional harvest every spring during their annual spawning migration, and they're just plucking them off the rocks, and they don't take a lot. Some of them they take for brood stock collection because they actually have some stocking programs where they're actually captive raising. They're spawning them and raising the larvae and then stocking them or translocating individuals to get them upstream further. In the case of the Susitna River, and I didn't know this until recently, thanks to Bruce Wright from Kinnick Tribe, there actually once upon a time was a Pacific lamprey harvest in the Susitna River, primarily for dog food for mushers. And it was a substantial harvest once upon a time, but populations are depressed there as well. And so we're wanting to get some of that, get local traditional knowledge, learn more about that subsistence harvest that took place in the system many years ago. So really sort of interesting things. A bit more about PLCI. What is it really? What PLCI is a collaborative partnership among a number of different groups. There's a whole host of indigenous tribes. There's a number of agencies ranging from federal to local agencies, various universities, as well as other research entities, non-governmental organizations, all working on the singular focus on Pacific lamprey conservation throughout its entire US distribution. British Columbia is not part of this yet. It's only a matter of time because they're Canadian. They're going to get wrapped into this too, and there's a lot of interest there as well. So it's going to be through the entire Pacific lamprey distribution eventually. A little bit about PLCI by the numbers. Currently 176 partners. There's 33 signatories to the conservation agreement, which I'll talk about in a moment. 18 regional management units. Alaska has its own regional management unit. The entire state is the regional management unit, which is a lot, it's big. 5 Western states are involved. Again, Alaska, California, Idaho, Oregon, Washington. And as I mentioned, there are 20 fish habitat partnerships. We're one of them. PLCI is one of them. as well as there's a number of others as well. The mission of PLCI is as follows. It's to achieve long-term persistence of Pacific lamprey and their habitats while continuing to support traditional indigenous cultural use. And so it's not to just rehabilitate these populations without anything else. They're still wanting to have cultural use of Pacific lamprey by indigenous groups. And so there's three components to PLCI. And I'm bringing this up because I'm going in a direction here. There's an opportunity to engage everybody here in the end. So there's a method to my madness, believe it or not. The three components are, the first one is the conservation agreement. And what the conservation agreement is a voluntary commitment among the PLCI partners to collaborate to reduce or eliminate threats to Pacific lamprey. And the way this is achieved is through what's called the regional management units, or the RMUs. Like I mentioned, Alaska is its own RMU. It's a big state, but there's 17 other RMUs, from Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and California. And so it's broken down here, sort of coastal and inland for the most part. And then within each RMU are a number of different drainages. The reason it's organized in this way is that it's to allow fine scale resolution on a drainage by drainage basis within these different units to look at the distribution, population biology, and habitat use and availability for Pacific lamprey. That sort of fine scale resolution allows for information exchange and collaboration both within and among the RMUs to identify unique threats and restoration actions within individual drainages within those RMUs. And then each RMU puts together what's called a RIP. It's a regional implementation plan. And I'll talk about that here in a second. Like I mentioned, we have an RMU, all of Alaska, that may be too big, but given kind of where we're at currently in their state of knowledge for Pacific lamprey, that's probably appropriate. And currently, myself and Sabrina Garcia from ADF&G are the co-leads for this RMU. If anybody is interested at all in knowing what we do, the RMU, please let me know. We're more than excited to have other people engaged with this. We want more people to get involved. So open invite for anybody. The second component of PLCI are the RIPs themselves, the regional implementation plans. And these, again, each RMU, each regional management unit has its own RIP. And these are documents that are used to identify, prioritize, and implement restoration actions for Pacific lamprey within the drainages within that regional management unit. And so we have a RIP for Alaska. We created it in 2019. It's been updated every year since then. So there was a 2020 version and a 2021 version. We'll be updating it again this next year for 2022. It's not hard to update them because there isn't a lot of information right now, but hopefully the plan is over time, these sort of, if you look at some of the other RIPs for other regional management units, they're quite stout documents because there's a lot of information. We have, like I said, a long ways to catch up. But basically what the RIPs contain is they summarize the status, distribution, and threats for Pacific lamprey within each drainage. So ultimately, in the case of the Alaska RIP, we would have information for the Susitna and the Copper and the Kenai and the Taku and the Unik and the Stikine and all these systems where we know that the Pacific lamprey spawn, and probably even in ocean phase, the Bering Sea and the northern Gulf of Alaska, but we're not there yet. Ultimately, we're going to hope to be there. The RIP highlights completed and ongoing conservation measures, so what is being done, identifies high priority projects that address key threats. This is where the Susitna comes in because we've identified that as right now the high priority project area because it's one we have a little bit of information and it's accessible because we can get to a lot of the systems on the road system, which as we know in Alaska isn't always a very easy feat to get access to locations where there are fish. And then also facilitate access to funding for lamprey related projects. The Fish Habitat Partnership Program provides funding, so we can write competitive proposals and bring in funding through PLCI. And there's other opportunities as well to do that type of a thing. And so all this information is detailed in the RIP. And if anybody is interested, I can provide that to anybody. The PLCI has its own website, and actually they're actually in a transition phase. They were used to be on the Fish and Wildlife Service website, but now migrating to their own website. So they don't have everything on there yet, but ultimately it'll be back on there. But you'll be able to go to the Alaska Regional Management Unit and look at the RIP. But in the interim, because it's not there yet, you can contact me. I can provide it. I'm more than happy to share that. And then the third and final component, this is where you can get involved, is what's called the assessment, the risk assessment. And what the risk assessment is, every 5 years, and 2022 is an assessment year. Every 5 years, PLCI partners evaluate and characterize the conservation risk on a RMU specific basis through the entire distribution of Pacific Lamprey. And so the conservation risk focuses on a couple things: on habitat, on distribution, on population demographics, and on threats. The first risk assessment was conducted in 2011. The next one was 2017 and 2018. This is the results of the 2017-2018 risk assessment, which uses a diagnostic tool called NatureServe. And so it rates on a drainage specific basis the current status of Pacific Lamprey, ranging from green, basically doing well, to red, not doing well at all, or somewhere in between, or black, where we just don't know anything. And as you can see, there's not a lot of green there. There's a lot of red and orange and yellow, some black. Alaska's not even on the map because in 2017, 2018, there was no assessment work being done for Pacific Lamprey. So it would all be black. It wouldn't even be black because there was nothing done. So that's where this year comes in, 2022, because we are now doing it. And the focus for this year isn't the entire state, because we know we don't have good information for the entire state, but we do have some information on the Susitna River. So the focus for 2022 is the Susitna River. And I'll come back to that here in a little bit. That's where one of the two areas that this group can get involved in. And I hope some folks take me up on that opportunity. And that kind of segues into the Susitna River and kind of some of the work we've done and what we plan to do. And it started in 2019, independent from PLCI. I wasn't even involved in it at that point in time. We got a little bit of pilot money from Fish and Wildlife Service to kind of poke around in the Susitna River. And the question was, could we find lamprey? We knew that there were supposed to be Pacific lamprey in there, as well as Arctic and Alaskan brook lamprey, but there hadn't been any real concentrated efforts. And so we went out and collected, and we chose some road accessible sites. We collect in a couple of ways. The larval lamprey, we sample using this device right here. This is a backpack electrofishing unit, but it's for lampreys. And so it produces a very unique voltage and amperage in the water that doesn't shock other fish, but only shocks lampreys. And so part of the challenge with the larvae is they're in these burrows, I mentioned, the sediment. And if you shock them with a traditional backpack shocker unit or any kind of electroshocking unit, you'd just freeze them up in their burrow. They wouldn't come out. And so what this lamprey shocker does is there's an intermittent pulse that the first initial pulse you put out is called a tickle pulse, and it irritates them. And so they begin to kind of snake their way out of the sediment. And when they kind of get their way out of the burrow, you hit the full pulse and it zaps them, and they get turned rigid, and you scoop them up. And they've got these little baskets in the probes that you can scoop them up with. So we sample larvae with the backpack unit, again, primarily targeting these little depositional areas or areas where we're on some woody debris, and they're down in the sediment down here. And that's what the larvae would look like after you scoop them up, and they're mobilized, but they recover amazingly fast. And then we also targeted spawning stage adults. They were easy to find. Canoeing, they're in riffles, shallow water areas, clear water. They're easy to spot, and you can just scoop them up with a dip net. They're not too challenging. We also collected water samples because we're interested in looking at eDNA, so we could say, okay, even though we might not be seeing lamprey, using their eDNA, maybe we could detect if they were there or not, both, again, regardless of species. So bring those samples back to the lab, identify the species, because the larvae are a little bit tricky. And actually, we can't even distinguish between Arctic and Alaskan brook lamprey at that level because they look too much alike. We did some biological attributes. We processed the water samples for eDNA. And the systems we sampled, again, we chose road accessible systems. And so going from sort of north to south, we had Rabideau, Birch, Montana, Caswell, Willow, and Meadow Creeks. And this is what we caught. And again, this is real quick sampling in June, late June. We had about a week to do it, so it wasn't a real concerted effort. It was, again, a pilot study. So in Rabideau Creek, we got 9 larval Lamprey, which that's the genus for Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey. We couldn't distinguish who they were. We got 2 adult spawning stage Arctic brook lamprey there. Birch Creek, 14 larval Lamprey, 1 spawning stage Alaskan brook lamprey. Montana Creek only got larvae. Caswell Creek got 6 spawning stage Alaskan brook lamprey and 1 spawning stage Arctic lamprey. Willow Creek, we got the 1 lone Pacific lamprey there. And then in Meadow Creek, we got a pile of larval lamprey and then 8 Alaskan brook lamprey. So that's not bad in a couple of days of sampling, given that we've never been there before and we were just sort of trying it out for the first time. And but that was good seed data, because so when we got the conversation started with PLCI, that led to them asking us to put together another proposal, which is going to get funded for this next year. And so the goal is to go back to the same 6 systems, but now sample spatial temporally much more broadly than we have in the past. So instead of this for a week in June, it's going to be a couple weeks in June, a couple weeks in July, a couple weeks in August, maybe September. And then we're also going to not just sample right close to the road, we're going to sample a lot more broadly, both upstream and downstream of the road, to get a better handle on spatial temporal dynamics within the system. And then we were asked to put together another proposal, which we submitted and looks pretty promising, that's going to get funded again through PLCI, to do the same 6 systems again in 2023 and 2024, and then add some other systems: Goose, Trapper, Sheep, Little Willow, and Cashwitna Creeks, and the Talkeetna River. I'm not sure where we're going to go yet in there, but we'll figure that out a little bit later. But the goal here is over the next 3 summers to expand dramatically our knowledge of Pacific lamprey, but also, but sort of by default, Alaskan brook lamprey and Arctic lamprey in this drainage. And I'm hoping that we can kind of keep this going for a while. Bruce and I are working on it. We're going to be working on a proposal, a tribal grant that we're going to hope to be able to bring on another graduate student to this project. And again, I open up the opportunity for any of you to get involved in some way. And so the ways to get involved are twofold. One is through this risk assessment that we're going to be conducting this year, and actually it's coming up pretty quick. We're going to have our first meeting of the Alaska RMU on April 8th from 11 to 12:30. And if you're interested, shoot me an email and I'll get you on the list, and I'll make sure that Sabrina gets you an invite. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go over the survey that we're going to implement for the Susitna River drainage and go through the various questions in the survey so you kind of understand what we're asking. And our expectation is not much. We don't think there's going to be a ton of information out there, but it's going to give us somewhere to start. And it's going to get folks engaged, and more importantly, it's going to get folks thinking about lamprey, which is something that hasn't happened very much in Alaska. And the idea is to use this as our sort of stepping stone to keep building our knowledge base on lamprey in the Susitna River, and then ultimately sort of jump into other systems like the Kenai and the Copper, et cetera, in southeastern Alaska. And so there's that opportunity. And so again, if you're interested, shoot me an email. I promise you the survey won't take a lot of time, and we'll keep you in the loop as we sort of process information. This is all culminating into a big event that's taking place in December called the Lamprey Summit. And this is taking place down in Portland. And it's going to be all the folks involved with PLCI getting together from all the different RMUs and talking about lamprey for about a week and giving various presentations and kind of what current state of the knowledge on Pacific lamprey. The other way you can get involved if you're interested in it is through sampling. And that can be coming out with us when we go out. And we don't have those dates quite picked yet. It's a little early. It's still very much winter here in Fairbanks, so I haven't really thought that specifically yet, although I want to be thinking about summer sampling here soon. But if you're interested, we're more than happy to have you come out. And most of our trips are going to be, 1 to 2 weeks at a time. It's going to be a lot of canoeing and hiking and camping out. And so it's kind of a fun sort of a thing. And we'll show you how to use the various gears. But the other thing you can do if you're ever out there doing sampling on your own, or just you're out fishing anywhere in the Susitna River, or you're out sampling with other projects. If you happen to find any lamprey, we have a sampling permit that I can provide that allows other people to collect lamprey for us. Because one of the things we want to do is I get people to contact me a lot. They'll say, hey, I saw this lamprey in this river. What was it? I'm like, I don't know. I need to have a picture. I need to look at its mouth structure. I need to see how big it was. And so if other folks are out there, and maybe out there more than we are, and they see lamprey, taking pictures and maybe collecting some samples for some extra citizen science would be great and would really help us out a lot. So that's kind of my spiel on lamprey. I'll stop my my sharing. But you can contact me, or you can contact any of the folks that are part of this presentation. If you maybe know them a little bit better and more comfortable contacting them, feel free to do so, and then they can get the information to me. But I'm more than happy to take any questions or answer provide any additional information, whatever you want. I'm here to talk about lamprey.
Oh, this is super exciting to hear about a species that we really don't know that much about right outside our door. There are some questions coming in on Facebook, like how far up the Susitna do you think that they travel?
Boy, I don't know. I have to admit, I don't know the drainage that well yet. I haven't spent a lot of time out there, just that one summer. And so everywhere we look, we found them. So I suspect they're going to go quite a ways upstream. Basically, what I've learned about my sampling here in interior Alaska, again, not on Pacific Lamprey, but on Arctic and Alaskan brook lamprey, is that when you start running into areas where you don't have any more, where it sort of gets, the substrate gets really rocky, cobbly, a lot of bedrock, you're getting to a point where you're getting too far upriver, because they need those downstream of that, those depositional areas where the larvae are going to rear. And so, like I said, I don't know the upper Susitna that well, but I would imagine that would be probably the maximum upstream that they would probably be, and they'd be somewhere downstream. And as you get to a point where it gets in the lower river, where depending on the substrate type, like we see this in the Tanana River, the lower Chena River, for example, is a lot of clay substrate, and that's too hard packed for them to make their burrows, and so we don't see many of them there. So they really like that sort of silty substrate, not sandy, because the burrow needs to remain intact, but not too clayey where it's too hard to burrow through it. It's sort of this in between. It's one of those things I can look at and I can tell you, but I can't quantify it very well. But I've seen it enough times where I can say, yeah, there's going to be lamprey in there. I can just tell by looking at it, and usually they're there. But that's what I would look for characteristic wise, is those types of things. So I'd have to spend some time looking at the drainage a little more closely to get it to sort of answer that well.
Cool, awesome. Another question is, how do lamprey fit into the food chain in the Susitna River system?
Everything likes to eat them, that's for sure. I know, what we see, there's for spawning stage lampreys, like I said, they're pretty large. Pacific lamprey are pretty large, and they're pretty lipid rich, and they're not strong swimmers, and they swim at the surface, and so they're vulnerable to everything. So I've seen lots of, matter of fact, I'm on a lamprey Facebook page, and they're over in the UK right now. They're spawning, and so or making their spawning migration. I've seen lots of pictures of like river otters carrying lamprey, eagles grabbing lamprey, seals and sea lions eating lamprey. If you have heard the story from Fairbanks from 2015, that was the year when lampreys are falling from the sky. If anybody has heard that, it was because spawning stage Arctic lamprey were making their upstream spawning migration in the Chena River, and a gull picked one up and dropped it in the Value Village parking lot, and it was still alive, and Fish and Game went and found it, and they put it in a fish tank, and it survived. And it became this big news story. And so there's this thing like vampire fish falling from the sky, blah, blah, blah. But basically everything will eat them. And so, and then with the larvae, I can't speak for the Susitna, but I know what I see here. And they spend a lot of time moving around. Like even the larvae sort of migrate downstream from location to location. That's sort of a natural thing that they do. And then ultimately they out-migrate in the case of Arctics and Pacific Lamprey. But everything will feed on them. Like burbot, like it's a great burbot bait. I've been actually backpack electrofishing and looked behind me, and there was a burbot sitting behind us picking off larval lamprey that were getting by us. But I know I've talked to anglers that pick them up in sheefish. You know, they look in sheefish stomachs or northern pike stomachs, and they're, you know, they don't have bones. I mean, lampreys don't have bones, and so basically they're just this bag of fat and very digestible. So everything likes to eat them. So they play a big role as prey for the entire ecosystem. And then when, in the case of the juvenile stage, they and out in the Bering Sea, northern Gulf of Alaska, they're feeding on primarily, in the case of Pacific lamprey, demersal fishes like, you know, halibut and cod. And in the case, like I mentioned, for Arctic lamprey, they're preying on like capelin and sand lance and herring and salmon smolts.
Cool. Joshua Jarvis says, hey, Sutton, first off, I would like to thank you for the presentation. And is it possible to use pheromones to help with sampling?
Well, in the Great Lakes, they do that. They actually, is one of the ways they attract lamprey to come back in a certain, I mean, one of the goals has been for a long time in the case of sea lamprey control in the Great Lakes has been to eradicate sea lamprey, but that's not going to happen. Hasn't happened yet. And so they've actually identified like the pheromones they use, and they use that to attract them, to trap them. And so, you know, I don't think that technology is quite there in the case of Pacific lamprey or other lamprey species, very sea lamprey specific. So maybe down the road, that could be something we use, but I don't think it's there quite yet. But yes, they looked at it for sea lamprey control quite extensively. There's been a lot of money funneled into that, like millions and millions of dollars. And it seems to work pretty well.
Nice. Chris Manick says, some local information. Both of our sons have fished Birch Creek for years. They've both seen small lamprey and one large lamprey that was 3 feet long. Also in Moose Creek off the Petersville Road, there are scads of spawning small lamprey in June.
Ah, there you go.
Pretty cool.
Yes, coordinates, send them my way. I'd be more than happy to go out there and take a look for them at some point.
Chris asks, we never see these on salmon or trout. Should we expect to if the lamprey population is strong?
Probably not. And the reason why, because Arctic lamprey are again predatory, so they're actually consuming either parts of fish or whole fish. So, and they're mostly focusing on little fish, like so capelin, sand lance, herring, salmon smolts. Like we looked in the guts of, we didn't expect this. We looked in the guts of Arctic lamprey from the Bering Sea. We were finding vertebrae, fin rays, otoliths. Like, so they're each actually able to eat whole fish. I don't know how they're doing it. Like, I don't, because you look at that mouth part, it isn't really conducive. It's not a jaws, right? So either they're grabbing them, and I don't know. But they're not like latching onto the side of a salmon or trout like you think about a sea lamprey. In the case of Pacific lamprey, their prey selection habitat choice is taking them somewhere where there's not going to be salmon. They're out in off shelf, deep water where there's again cod, pollock, halibut, those bigger demersal bottom dwelling fishes for the most part. So I would, if I saw them on salmon, I would be quite surprised by that. But we actually, here's an interesting thing, things you see them hanging on sometimes. There's been a lot of recent documentation of them hanging on whales. And so the question has come, are they getting nutrition from whales? Are they somehow able to rasp through the blubber and somehow get to a blood supply? Or are they just hitching a ride? And no one knows the answer to that one yet. So that's another question we need to get at. Not Arctic lampreys, but Pacifics, because Arctics don't really do that.
Crazy. Yeah, I wonder too, you were talking about the change in sea ice. Are they having trouble getting further upstream if the sea ice is, or not the sea ice, the river ice is not freezing up as early? Like if it's not forming as early, can they not travel as far upstream? Will that change their distribution?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, by the time they get up to like the mid Yukon, it's December, so there's usually ice by then. I think it's that lower. It's a question. I've looked at the data. So I got all the test fishery data dating back to like 2013, and I plotted it all and sort of looking at run timing, like when they're coming in. And it's confounding in the sense that it looks like they're coming earlier and earlier every year. But the sampling has been earlier and earlier every year too. And so is it that they're coming in earlier, or were they already coming in earlier? They just weren't sampling early enough. And then they can only sample really effectively in the test fishery until slush ice starts to form in the Yukon, and then they can't run their nets anymore and they have to shut it down, which usually happens in early October. So there's this gap period from early October until the fishery starts, which is the end of November, where we don't know where they're at. Like, we have no idea where they're at. That's where, if we can put some transmitters in some lamprey and start tracking them around, like, we may learn some interesting things about where they're going, how fast they're getting there. I mean, a lot of what we think we know about them is based on this fishery under the ice, but it's what they're doing, as you just kind of bring up, like when there's not ice, what's going on? Like, I don't know. We don't know. I mean, so it's like, that makes it fun and exciting to kind of want to go, but also it'd be nice to know, just so we know.
Right. It seems like with so many things changing, they are changing too. And so
that's a big concern. Like, do we not have are we missing the baseline data? Like, did we miss that window? And so now it's going to be a new baseline, right? So by the time we learn it, it might be things that might have changed to some extent.
Right. Lucas says ADFG staff are completing surveys for the anadromous water catalog to run into lamprey occasionally. What are some of the photos or other data that you would need?
Yeah, so a couple of things, basic things that I could use. Approximate length. Like, you don't have to measure it to the millimeter. I mean, if you did, that'd be awesome. But if you can get, okay, it's like, 12 inches or 6 inches or whatever it might be, that gives me some idea, because scale, or even with the scale next to it, is kind of nice. Because I know if you said to me, it had like a suctorial disc, but it was 6 inches long, I say, oh, it's going to be it's going to be an Alaskan brook lamprey. But if you say it's 12 inches long or 24 inches long, that tells me different things. A picture of the mouth is always great, because in the case of those juveniles where they have that suctorial disc, I can look at the dentition patterns and tell you exactly what it is. Because, for example, Arctic lampreys have bicuspid teeth, and Pacific lampreys have tricuspid teeth. So you can look at the numbers of notches in their teeth. In the case of the Alaskan brook lamprey, they have really weak dentition, so you can tell that as well, along with size. The larvae are a little more challenging, and that's where having a sample could come in handy. So a picture, especially of the caudal fin, like the tail, you can look at some pigmentation and they can give you some indication. It's a little bit tough to do. We've tried some other techniques that don't seem to work very well. So if you ever have the need, or you ever have the opportunity to get a sample, like I said, I can provide you with a collector's permit that would allow you to help us out. And all I need is just to have the lamprey thrown in a plastic bag and put in the freezer. And I can arrange to get it from you at some point in time. And as long as you don't mind a lamprey in your freezer, it's not going to be a problem. Like I said, I have a lot of them in my freezer, so. And then also along with that, like any location information, if you have GPS coordinates, like that's helpful too. Time of year.
Okay, cool. Parker asks, do the adults cue in on species-specific biosalts when migrating upstream, i.e. will Pacific lamprey cue in on biosalts from Arctic lamprey?
Ooh, well, I don't know. That's a good question. One of the things I always say is, like, there's a lot of variation among adult lamprey or juvenile lamprey, but larval lamprey or larval lamprey. But that is the one area that I don't know that if that's really true. Like, because they, like, history-wise, they all seem very similar, and they like we find these Alaskan brook in Arctic lamprey larvae in the same locations. They have to be, because we can't distinguish them. But I don't know about the biosalts. So that's a great question. That is, if somebody wants to do a graduate project, we can come up with something. That'll be a fun one to look at. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that one.
Yeah, cool. Well, that makes it more exciting. Barbara says, thanks for introducing us to these creatures. And then William says, 2 years ago, I was surprised to see about 10 to 15 of what I thought might be eels in a tributary of Caswell, where the small stream goes under Hidden Hills Road. So thank you. Your talk tells me what I saw.
People call them river eels all the time, even though they're not eels. Eels have jaws, just so if you know that.
Interesting.
True eels have jaws. Lampreys do not.
Huh. Barbara Parker asks, have you eaten them?
I have not. I'm embarrassed to say that I have not eaten lamprey before, and I need to rectify that very soon, because most of the time when I get lamprey, they're samples that I collect for field work, and well, that's the reason why I have not eaten any, and so I need to resolve that. So I have my list of things to do this summer.
Another question is, salmon get a lot of attention. What are the overlaps and threats to lamprey populations and salmon populations, and what are unique to lamprey?
Yeah, I mean, spawning habitat is the big one. They spawn in the exact same areas. I mean, shallow riffle areas with cobble substrate. So anything that would impact that, like whether it's warming, siltation, one of the big reasons that Pacific lamprey decline in the Columbia drainage is because of all the dams. So even though they can climb, like I mentioned in Willamette Falls, they climb up those falls or even smaller falls. They can't climb up a dam. And because they're such weak swimmers, fish passage is really challenging. They can do it, but they're not very proficient at it. This because of the velocities involved in a fish ladder, for example, or some type of a passage structure. There's actually some work looking at how do we make more lamprey friendly passage structures. But, we don't have that issue in Alaska. Like we don't have dams per se. Hopefully keep it that way. But the spawning habitat is the one primary similarity. Even some of the rearing habitat, like you think about where, juvenile salmon, like, Chinooks and cohos, where they rear in a stream, usually, depositional zone with some woody debris, soft substrates. Those same areas are where you find larval lamprey. And so very similar habitats, like I said, Arctic, well, all lamprey species are similar pairs, so they spawn and die. And, one of the, I don't know this from any of the work that we've done in Alaska or that I've read in the United States, but in Japan, they've done a lot of this work looking at the effects of warming. And Arctic lamprey specifically are very, they don't handle warm conditions very well. And so, Arctic lamprey, I think this is true, are kind of like the canary in the coal mine, because they're the northernmost distributed lamprey species we have. And so as climate change goes and what the impacts they're going to have, I think Arctic lamprey are going to go. So you might see shifts northward. They might not do as well. And so systems like the Susitna, which is at the bottom end of their distribution, they might be impacted more. We don't have any baseline data to compare that to, though. So I don't know what it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago. Same for Pacific lamprey, other than some of this maybe LTK, which hopefully we can get a better understanding of. And so those are some of the I think, concerns that, aren't unique to. We see the effects of warming on salmon, right? It's a big concern, not just for, lampreys as well. So a lot of the same factors that impact salmon impact lamprey too. And then when you get out into the marine environment, like you mentioned, Arctic lamprey feed on things like capelin and sand lance and herring, and their abundances are down too. Capelin are a cold water species, and we have less cold water than we used to have. So that's going to have an impact on the adult stage, which means fewer fish return to spawn, and there you go. So, and we see declines in halibut abundance and cod abundance, and that has impacts on Pacific lamprey adult or juveniles when they're feeding as well.
Kyle asks, once we determine population status of the lamprey, what will we use that information for? Conservation efforts through protection, where spawning times and fragility of that time, fragility during that time. What do you anticipate using that information for?
Yeah, I think a part of it is just to get baseline information for future comparisons to see how things are going. I think trying to match up abundance information with life history and habitat availability. And so, in systems that are fairly pristine, that maybe habitat isn't really that impacted. Maybe it's just that there's something else impacting abundance, and that could be something out in the marine environment, or might be something else. But right now, like I said, we don't have any basic information on even like this density. Just to get out and just look at if we could put together simple distribution maps to have an idea that, like we did in the Chino and the Chattanooga River. And so I can tell you in those systems where you expect to find them, and I can give you some rough estimates of density. And so then as things change, then it's something I can compare it to, whether that's warming or development within the drainage, or, it's, Susitna has been like long talk, as you all know, about dams. And so that's, I would not be surprised if lamprey would be impacted by that in some way, because it's going to change river dynamics completely. And so that's all, I think, valuable information to have that can be used for those purposes, as well as the sort of monitoring these populations, and then comparing them to, other systems, whether this, in Alaska or outside of Alaska, where we have a lot more information, which will give you some idea of population trajectories. And so again, it's all just, I kind of look at it like it's all a big puzzle, and we're just trying to get little pieces of the puzzle, putting it together. And then by doing that, we begin to understand, like, oh yeah, here's what it looks like, kind of thing. And that's kind of what we're striving for in these types of assessments. So anything we can get is valuable.
So when they spawn and die, I know there's a lot of research that has gone into salmon and that nutrient deposition. Is there a similar scenario going on with lamprey?
Marine derived nutrients?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, the same thing would happen, and that's one of the big shortcomings of runs being, so at such low levels compared to historically, is that you lose that marine derived nutrient source to those systems. I mean, when they're heading up into those, I wouldn't call them headwater streams, but they're heading up to, these clear water tributaries where, there are kind of headwater-ish in a lot of ways. I mean, that might be one of the primary nutrient sources at that time of year that really, a lot of macroinvertebrates utilize, and as well as other predators that would pick them up that are feeding on decomposing prey. One of the interesting things we found in the Chena River with Arctic lamprey is that when you go, in the early fall, when after chum salmon have spawned, and you see there's like spawn out carcasses laying all over the place, if you flip those over, loaded with larval lamprey underneath them. So that's it's a sort of a nutrient source that other lamprey are utilizing too. It's not just other organisms are utilizing it.
Oh, that's super cool. And then you think about if chum runs are declining, how that kind of,
it all ties together.
Yeah, really cool. Well, is there anything else you would like to add to today, or any more questions from folks that are here listening?
I mean, I just, like I said, it's an open invite. I mean, I welcome the opportunity to talk to this group, and I'm more than happy to come back in the future, whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now or whenever, to talk about what we found and share that with all of you. Because I love talking about lampreys, that you can probably imagine based on how excited I am about this, which I don't get excited very easily, but it's an opportunity for anybody. You don't have to be a biologist to be involved in what we're doing. It's open for anybody. And like I said, if you want to be engaged in some way, we'll get you involved, whether it's through the survey or sampling, or if you can help us find lampreys, or even if you're out and you see some, you can shoot me an email and let me know, and that'll let us know, like, hey, they're out here right now. We'll make sure we get out there. So yeah, anything, because the more eyes, the better. I mean, that helps us. And you're going to be in places that I wouldn't even know about getting to. So anything would be helpful.
Yeah, I hope you come back and tell us what you learned this summer. That'd be really exciting to hear about. And
absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you so much, Trent. I would like to flag tomorrow, the Matsu Borough and Ada are hosting an open house for the West Susitna Access Road. That will be from 4 to 7. There will be a presentation by Ada, and then a public question period, and that's again for the West Susitna Industrial Access Corridor. The borough public comment period will end on March 31st. So if you have comments about that, please get them in. This was our last winter speaker event for this series. It will be uploaded onto YouTube, and I can share that with folks if you email me, and I'll drop my email here in the chat as well. Just to make sure if you want to share it with anyone, anything like that. And again, thank you so much everyone for joining us. Have a great night, and we look forward to hearing about your summer field studies, Trent.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.